Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Kathryn Lloyd, Vice President of Programs and Interpretation here at the Tenement Museum. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all, both in person, where we have a few guests, and all of you watching virtually. It is our great honor to co-sponsor this program with the Immigrant History Research Center at the University of Minnesota and Define American. We are coming to you tonight from the Tenement Museum's recreated 1960s tenement apartment here at 103 Orchard Street. So in this living room, the Size Velez family would have gathered every evening, every Sunday in particular. This was a space where they watched TV, where they spent time with family and friends, and where we can imagine they talked about the big issues of their time, right? What was going on in the 1960s, 1970s that was important to them as a Puerto Rican family? How were they being impacted by what was going on outside of these walls of their tenement? And now visitors come to this space every single day. Maybe some of you watching have been on tours in this space. And we invite you all, right, into these conversations about what's going on in the country and how what's going on connects to what's happening within these families' experiences. So tonight's conversation is going to take us into a really critical issue of our time, and one that we have seen as an issue in the past. We'll look at how xenophobia and anti-immigrant ideas are spreading today, how that compares to what was going on in the 19th century, early 20th century, and also what we can all do to work against what's going on right now. So it is my great pleasure to be sharing the room tonight with our two guests. And Shauna Siggelkow is the Director of Digital Storytelling at Define American. She's a video producer who worked very closely on Define American's newest research report on xenophobia that we'll be really digging into tonight, seeing what they learned from studying, in particular, what's going on YouTube, and how YouTube, on which we are coming to you tonight live. We'll be discussing how this platform, how we can better understand what's going on the platform. And we're also honored to welcome Erika Lee, who's the director of the Immigrant History Research Center at the University of Minnesota, an author and historian, and really a foremost expert on how we understand what's going on with xenophobia now, based on what was happening in the past. So Erika, Shauna, welcome. Really looking forward to the important conversation we're going to have tonight. And I thought we could just start out by having you share a little bit about how you came to work on this topic of xenophobia. How did you get into it before we look at some of the research that's come out recently? So Shauna, you want to start us out?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us. Define American, we're very excited to be partnering with the Tenement Museum on this great live stream. So I came to Define American actually as a documentary filmmaker. I was working at MTV at the time, actually, and I was put on a project called White People, which was in 2014. It was a documentary where we traveled the country and spoke with young white people about their ideas around race and equity. And it was a really important project for me in my career, and also just personally in terms of understanding my own background, my own family story. And from that project, I went on to do other short films about emerging American identities across the country. And I came to work at Define American in 2016, really through the relationship with my mentor and friend, Jose Antonio Vargas, who is the founder of Define American. And our mission at the organization is to advocate for more humanized portrayals of immigrants in media. We really feel that by telling better stories about the immigrant experience, we can eventually affect change. And so I've been at Define American ever since.
Thank you. Erika.
First of all, it's just an honor to be here in the Tenement Museum alongside you two. Define American and the Tenement Museum are amongst my most treasured, my most favorite institutions that have inspired me, my students, my teaching, my writing, my advocacy. So I'm just thrilled to be here in this room in the museum. How did I get interested in the topic of xenophobia? It's not typically one that you would think we would want to focus on, especially since it is not just anti-immigrant ideas, it is violence, it is racism, it's discrimination, it captures some of our darkest, most grisly chapters in American history. And, you know, for me as a historian, a teacher, an author, but also as a third-generation Chinese American, this is not only an intellectual project. You know, ever since I was in college, I was inspired by the stories, the histories of people who move. What inspired people to give up everything and to move across an ocean or to move across a land border to come to the United States? What drove Americans to both welcome them and shun them? And it's that just really complicated history and contemporary environment of immigration that has always kept me going back to the books, to the archives, but also to everyday people, both migrants themselves, migrant families, and then those on the other side, the folks that I know that we're going to continue to talk about. 2016 was also what happened in 2016? I don't know. Here we are in an immigrant history museum. Can you guess what happened in 2016? That would make us all want to think about the topic of xenophobia again. For me, this is a topic that I've been writing about and teaching about really my entire career. And it was very much inspired not only by that intellectual question, but also my family's own history of Chinese exclusion, of Asian exclusion that lasted for generations. But it was in 2016, the day after the presidential elections, that I sat in my classroom of immigration history, trying to answer the questions of my students, many of whom were first-generation immigrant and refugees. And they said, what happened? How could this happen? I thought we were a nation of immigrants. We thought that with President Obama, this was all over and done with. And I tried and I stumbled over the academic responses, and I just felt like that was a fail. And I went back to my office, I looked at all my books on my shelf, and I sort of stacked them up, and I decided, I don't think we historians have done a good enough job explaining this. And so I'm going to try again. And I wrote a book and trying to explain the systemic roots of xenophobia as racism in the United States, and published that in 2019, and then the pandemic hit, and I wrote an epilogue on racism and xenophobia during the pandemic. So this has been an ongoing, involved, not just intellectual, but personal and political effort to not just explain how this happened, but also what's at stake, and then what do we do about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. And that sense of the personal impact of these ideas is, really also at the heart of what the Tenement Museum does, just trying to understand how real people in the past were impacted by immigration laws, by what was going on, whether it's in, Washington with politicians or, in the streets of towns across the country. So, I think the conversation tonight, which will also include you, please, we want to hear from you, your questions, your comments, connections, please share in the chat. We welcome them in, but I think our conversation will really look to explore, how that personal is connected to some of these much bigger ideas that we'll be talking about. So we wanted to start out with a little intro to Define American's recent report, which was really what sparked us to put together this conversation to begin with, looking at this really, really important new research that came out. So Shauna, if you'll give us a little introduction, and then we'll watch a short video and then discuss.
Yes, absolutely. So the report is called Immigration Will Destroy Us and Other Talking Points, Unpacking the Anti-Immigration Tactics on YouTube. Just a little background on why we decided to look at this, this space. we, around 2018, we were producing a lot of projects for digital consumption, trying to tell underrepresented immigrant stories. Like I mentioned earlier, Define American, we really believe that if we can change the media narrative around this issue, eventually we can change policy and change lives. But we started getting really frustrated because we realized that the digital content that we were producing, even when we had great distribution partners, even when we felt like we were telling stories that we found very compelling and important to highlight a lot of underrepresented issues, we realized that in digital spaces they just weren't being seen by the right audiences, by the people who we really felt needed to hear these stories to potentially change their minds or open their minds about this issue. So that started actually a 3-year research project where we looked at YouTube as a platform. And just really briefly, we chose YouTube for a few different reasons. There was a body of research that came out that really pointed to YouTube as the most effective platform for far-right radicalization, especially around white supremacy. So we knew that essentially there was smoke, and we wanted to see what the fire was when it came to xenophobic content. And that began the research project. I'll hand it over to a short clip now that will explain a little bit about our findings.
Define American, we've been looking at how online anti-immigration videos shape public opinion. We studied the top anti-immigration videos from the past 13 years, and we looked at the channels that publish them. Almost every video on this list presents arguments that ultimately support the white nationalist theory of the Great Replacement. So we named the network of channels the Great Replacement Network, or the GRN for short. The Great Replacement originates from Europe and was made popular in 2012 by French nationalist René Camus. It has become a critical narrative driving white nationalism in the United States. It theorizes that immigrants of color will replace white populations in predominantly white countries. The videos within the GRN support this theory by arguing that increased immigration to the US will bring violence, disease, religious extremism, and ultimately the destruction of Western civilization. The messaging of these videos can really be summed up into one sentence. It's logical to be anti-immigration because ultimately immigration will destroy us. These alternative online networks are influencing mainstream narratives in our politics and culture. The battleground for the future of civil rights is happening on social media today, and it's critical that human rights advocates become more familiar with the tactics and networks of the alternative right-wing internet. If we want to make a difference in this fight, we need to understand the battleground, and it's time to build the resources and infrastructures to fight back.
Well, I think all of the explainer videos that Define American has made around this have been so helpful for just seeing what was in this research. But recap for us, what were your main findings in looking into what's going on YouTube right now?
Sure. So we went into this report with a few different questions. The first was, is YouTube the right platform for us to examine? Like I mentioned earlier, there was some research that was pointing us in that direction, but we really weren't sure if this was an important space for Americans to make up their minds about immigration, shape public opinion. So we partnered with a group called Change Research, and we did a series of polls in swing states during the 2020 election cycle. And we looked at regular YouTube viewers. So these are folks who watch YouTube at least once a week. And what we found was that, yes, YouTube is an extremely important space for shaping hearts and minds around immigration. From those polled, 63% had spoken with friends or family about immigration after watching something about the topic online, on YouTube in particular. And that statistic was really important to us for a few reasons. 63% is a really high number, right? But also, a report had come out of the Norman Lear Center in 2018 that looked at traditional television viewership and how that translated into real-world action. And what they saw from that report was actually 59% of people spoke with friends or family after watching a social issue on television. So what we're seeing is actually YouTube has even more potential to cause real-world action than traditional television. We also saw that there were political implications. 28% of those polled contacted a representative after seeing content about immigration, and 21% changed their votes for an elected representative. That's not necessarily, switching political parties in a presidential election, but it's still really significant political action because of content that they saw on YouTube. To the first question, is YouTube an important space for this issue? Absolutely yes. It's an important space, not just for folks like Define American who are concerned with media narrative, but also for everyone involved in the immigrant rights movement who are concerned about the trends we're seeing around this issue. The next step in our report really looked at what the content on YouTube was that was producing all of this anti-immigrant rhetoric. So we developed a landscape analysis of anti-immigration YouTube. We looked at the top performing anti-immigration videos of the last 15 years. Who was producing them, what were the central messages that were being pushed in the content, and we saw really decipherable trends. And this is what really made me think of Erika's work and the Tenement Museum as well, because a lot of the patterns that we saw clearly are not in a vacuum. They ahistorical. They exist throughout our histories. And what we really saw was all of the different talking points across the content on YouTube really pointed to an overall narrative structure that played into the Great Replacement theory. And just really briefly, the Great Replacement theory, if viewers are not familiar with it, it's an anti-Semitic, racist, white nationalist theory that immigrants of color are essentially coming to the United States to replace the white population.
And here's where, in our preparation conversations for tonight, we were, sort of struck with this question of like, where does this come from? How can we see these messages in the past? And in particular, I was sort of curious, like, Erika, from your research, if we were to see a report from the 19th century like this, what ideas would we see in it? Would we see roots of the Great Replacement theory?
So a Define American had existed in the mid-19th century, which I wish it had. Just a couple of points about the report that I have found so astonishing is to be able to track the network. Organizations like the Council of American Islamic Relations have done similar research on Islamophobia and have found this organized activity, well-funded, highly organized, and just a media machine that has helped to seed and then promote and disseminate Islamophobic messages. And similarly, I think the report has found this organized activity, which is so important because, and that it impacts actual political behavior. And it's so important because one of the myths about xenophobia in our history, I think, is that for too long we have dismissed it. We have thought of it as something that's unfed. It's been perpetrated by extremists or crackpots, that it has, this is literally from, the classic book on xenophobia that all students were required to read up until pretty recently, but that xenophobia rises and falls, and that it's almost natural. Economic recession, of course we're going to blame the immigrants. Oh, that's too bad, but it's kind of natural. And then, eventually when the economy gets better, it'll be okay. And what I think that not only the history shows, but the research shows, is that it doesn't just rise and fall. This is built into systemic racism. It was built upon our enslavement of African peoples. It was built upon our taking away of land and the dispossession of the indigenous peoples. And it has to be understood as part of that foundation. So the Great Replacement theory, its roots go back to the late 19th to the early 20th century, it's essentially the same message. Immigration will destroy us. I want us to think about two individuals. One was named Madison Grant, who I know Tenement Museum educators know well. He was a well-known, respected member of New York society. He was also a leading eugenicist, and he purported that the Native American stock, small n, not indigenous peoples, but US-born Native American stock, meaning white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, were committing, quote unquote, race suicide by allowing an invasion of inferior races. And he was talking about Jews, all of the people, all of the people who would have come and lived in 103 Orchard Street. Southern, Eastern Europeans, Hispanics, Asians, these were the inferior peoples that were deliberately coming to invade the United States, to usurp true Americans of their power, and to cause its destruction. He wrote a book in 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race. So very, like you couldn't connect those two dots with the Great Replacement Theory close enough. And then his protege, a man named Lothrop Stoddard, wrote in 1920, 1921, another book called The Rising Tide of Color, the global threat to white supremacy. And in it, global migration, specifically from Asia, was identified as like the biggest peril facing not just the United States, but he included all white countries, white man's countries, literally. So we see these books and organized activity, including by the lobbying group, the Immigration Restriction League, helping to pass legislation. The 1921-1924 Immigration Acts essentially closes the door largely to all of those inferior races, and that it doesn't open up again until 1965, which is so nice to be in this room. Yeah. But we've seen the repetition, not just through Donald Trump. He would not have been elected had it not been for people like Patrick Buchanan and his books published in the 2000s, one including State of Emergency, something about a third world invasion and the ruin of the United States. There's like a series of these sensationalist books that have become mainstream. The ideas have become mainstream and have been sort of built into our politics and also just the ways in which we think about immigration.
Yeah, certainly. And I think back to, your story at the beginning of your students in your class in 2016 of saying, how can this happen? And sort of this sense of the, duality of the United States as this place of welcoming and yet also this place with this kind of foundation. And what we can do to sort of grapple with that. And I'm also was really struck sort of sitting here in this 1960s living room thinking about how the Lower East Side evolved because of the impact of some of these ideas of Madison Grant and Stoddard and how that 1924 law really transforms the landscape of the Lower East Side. The Jewish immigrants and Italian immigrants who had been moving in came in many fewer numbers. And then Puerto Rican and African Americans coming into the neighborhood found that they were facing a city that wasn't quite as welcoming as maybe they had expected. So, you see that within the 150 years in which the Tenement Museum explores the way in which we do see how the neighborhood is really shaped by who can and can't move here and how that's happened because of some of these ideas. And so, another link we were really finding is just in like the particular ideas that are being drawn on within some of these videos. So could you go over just like, I think we were talking about, right, the sense of a national security threat from immigrants or a religious threat. And I'd love for us to then sort of see like, what are those ideas today and where do we see them in sort of the historic record being shared?
Absolutely, yes. And I do just want to a point that Erika made around intentionality and how, I think there is a pervasive idea out there that xenophobia is just, it's just an unfortunate part of our history that's almost natural, you can't help it. But that's also not what's happening currently. We know that there is an extensive network of anti-immigrant think tanks in Washington that are pouring millions of dollars of funding into an anti-immigration media machine, like you mentioned in the past. And I think it's really important for the public to better understand that this is not a grassroots movement. This is coming from a top-down, well-funded media machine. But to the content itself, outside of the Great Replacement theory, which we did see as kind of an overarching narrative structure for the videos overall, particular messages that we saw imbued in the content, a lot of fear-mongering, a lot of telling the audience that their identity, their jobs, their safe immigrant communities, and specifically immigrants of color. That actually is implicit and explicit in some of the content. I'm thinking particularly of this one hyper-viral video that I'm not going to name it because I don't want you to Google it. But it's set in a lecture hall, and you have someone who looks like a professor presenting about mass immigration, and he counts each gumballs as 1 million immigrants of color. And there are no European gumballs on that stage. They are all people of color. And next to him is a small glass, and he puts thousands and thousands of these gumballs on the stage, and the small glass is supposed to symbolize the United States, right? And so what does that in a visual tell us? It's the Great Replacement theory. It's saying, how can we possibly accommodate this mass number of people in our tiny little limited country, our limited resources, our limited access to social welfare and protections that, narratively speaking, immigrants are often, the bad guys, the ones who are taking advantage of social services. So I think that the messages that we really saw were around fear of scarcity and also safety. And there were two central stereotypes that the content really relied upon. We saw for illegal immigration, undocumented folks who were Latinx, criminals, usually associated with criminality and drugs, border crossing. And then on the other side, kind of attacking the legal immigration system, we saw a lot of portrayals of anti-Muslim storylines. So the message there is that asylum seekers who are Muslim are secretly terrorists, secretly posing a threat to Americans born in this country.
Yeah.
I'd love to pull up a 1903 cartoon, this will be taking us back, almost 120 years now, published in one of our most illustrious magazines. Its title is The High Tide of Immigration and National Menace. And you'll see Uncle Sam as this outsized character, but he's under threat. He is standing with his back up against a cliff while a literal flood of menacing rat-like migrants are coming as a wave onto the shores of the United States. And they're drawn so stereotypically racist, it's very easy to identify that they are the Italian mafia boss, the Chinese coolie, the Mexican rebel. And the message here is that, of course, that immigration is this endless thread of flood, an invasion, a threat, one that requires a military defense, that there's just nothing that can stop it unless we either arm ourselves or close the gates. And it's not just the American people, but behind Uncle Sam is American ideas and institutions. So our entire democracy, our way of government, our civilization is under threat from immigration. This is, and in some ways the threat changes, but once you establish what one of my colleagues, Natalia Molina, calls a racial script, you use that playbook again. And in the archival documents, it's very easy to see that slippage or that connection. We thought the Chinese were bad. Well, the Japanese are just like them, or they're even worse. So you establish who is the main evil threat, and then you add to it. You compare and contrast, and it's important because it's not just those who are coming in illegally, as many of those groups were doing in the early 20th century, but then it's being used to justify restrictions to legal immigration. Yeah. It compromises the whole nation of immigrants idea. It compromises and delegitimizes the idea of that immigration is good for the United States, period, which is what is, all of it is extremely troubling, but right. I want us to understand that just the impact of it is so great.
Yeah. And I think too, just how heavy it can be to repeat some of this and to listen to it and talk about it, and certainly to research it. Just want to give a moment to recognize that, right? And how difficult and troubling this really is. And how much it impacts real people today and in the past. And, in thinking about this too, I'm just struck on how it relies on and reinforces this sense of a hierarchy, right? And this sense of keeping that hierarchy in place within this country. And so similarly, right, these sort of stereotypes and metaphors that are used about a flood or an invasion, and how much language has played into the perpetuation of some of these ideas.
I'm really annoyed at our just mainstream news, the words that are constantly used to describe migration.
Actually, my colleague Liz Robbins, who she works in our journalism partnership space, she did a report on, I think it was the first 90 days of the Biden administration, looking at how migrants were described. And I was thinking about your visual earlier, and the power of a visual and the power of an effective metaphor. And she found in her research that analogies connecting migrants to water,
of course,
were seen throughout. So flood of migrants, rising tide of migrants. And once I think people make that trickle, it's actually really bizarre that water keeps coming up. And what a powerful metaphor to make people afraid of the natural trend of migration.
Yeah, and it's something we've talked about a bit at the Tenement Museum, is just as far as the language that we use to talk about different groups who've come here, because the language, at least that I learned, in my education, was to talk about waves of immigration, right? And that's just sort of such a common way that, we have tended to talk about different groups and sort of that evolution over time. And I've sort of been challenging myself to think of different ways to describe that, right? And think that although wave might be, a word that isn't harmful, at its face, like what is that contributing to? Yeah. So it's been on our minds, right? Just thinking about in our tours every day, how do we talk about these patterns and trends in ways that don't contribute to larger stereotypes? And certainly, that cartoon we saw, it was 1903. That's a time when, the Levine family, Harris and Jenny Levine, were raising their 6 kids in a tenement on this block. We tell their story every day here at the museum. And, I sometimes think about, did they ever see that cartoon, right? Did people encounter this type of media? And if so, right, how does that feel, right? What might Harris or Jane Levine think about seeing this cartoon, and how in some ways it has created then this pattern of immigrant groups really pushing back and resisting, and trying to reclaim or redefine the way that they're seen in the media. So we'll get into packaging and sort of that language in a little bit. But the other message that I think we really see throughout time is that of immigrants as a public health threat. And when we were again talking before this, I was really just drawn to your sort of memory of this neighborhood in early 2020, and just how Chinatown and the Lower East Side were really the earliest hit in New York by the fear within the larger society, and how then this anti-Asian racism that we have seen throughout the last few years, how that really is tied to everything that we're talking about. So what is that origin of sort of seeing immigrants as a public health threat? And then for you, did you see that at all in any other research?
So the language is so important here, because if we just focus on the word invasion, invasive species, a pathogen, a foreign body, right? So there is this automatic connotation to disease, to foreigners being an invasive species, to being foreign to the body politic of the United States, and for bringing in dangerous and loathsome contagious diseases, which is a direct quote from the 1891 Immigration Act. But even before then, even before we had a federal mechanism to close gates and to put in public health measures as part of immigration restriction, there is this ideology of identifying immigrants as foreigners and bringing in dangerous ideas and public health threats. So as early as the late 1700s, Germans are blamed for bringing in yellow fever, which in Philadelphia is called German flu. In 1900, in San Francisco, the Chinese were segregated in Chinatown during a bubonic plague scare. It's very specific. Italians were blamed for bringing in polio. Tuberculosis was considered the Jewish disease.
I mean, actually, the Levine family that I just mentioned, they're making garments in their apartment, and tuberculosis being called the tailor's disease was sort of intentionally about the mostly Jewish immigrants who were so enclosed in their homes. Right. So that sort of use of a word that then was basically referring to a particular population.
To a group, to a religion. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So when the news reports of the novel coronavirus were starting to circulate from China, and almost automatically we also saw reports, many may not have been paying attention to it, but reports of anti-Chinese and anti-Asian sentiment happening in Australia, and then as the virus spread in Europe and Canada, and then the United States. And for me and many others, I was feeling like this pit in the bottom of my stomach was just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and wondering not if it was going to happen here, but when, and how bad was it going to be. And I have to say that I don't think that I at least could have anticipated how bad it has become and how bad it continues to be. And I'm getting emotional here, but it really is, as a historian, I feel like I may have a better sense of anticipating things, but then to realize that it actually does become reality, and how impactful it has been on the entire Asian American population, from our elders to young kids who are being spat upon in their own homes. It's just incredibly it's incredibly upsetting. And we know that at least, close to 11,000 reported hate crimes have happened across the United States, which is probably just a fraction of what has really happened over the past couple of years. And it continues. I know that we're all feeling like the pandemic is over, but this racism and violence related to anti-immigrant and anti-Asian racism, it has deep and long roots and was here before the pandemic and will continue after, unfortunately.
I think it's important to really recognize the emotional impact of that and just how we can talk. We're sitting here having this intellectual conversation about this, but
and
at the end of the day, this is a really
on the borders of Chinatown now.
Yeah. I actually just want to invite us to take a moment of silence for those who have been murdered through this. That this has real world impact, and having this conversation is, we hope, inspiration to challenge all of us to work towards a place where this does not happen.
And I do feel that the work of all of these organizations that we represent is doing exactly that.
Yeah.
The narrative change, the storytelling, the preservation of our histories, but not just the preservation of history for history's sake, but to be used in order to affect change today.
Yeah. And I want to bring us to that, right? Of what do we sort of see as the way to fight back against this and to work against some of these ideas spreading?
Yes. Well, before we move on, I do just have to say that 11,000 hate crimes. That's an astounding number, and I think we were talking about how immigrant populations are often framed as a public health crisis, right? That's one of the tools in the toolkit, the xenophobic toolkit to attack these communities. But that number of hate crimes, that's a public health crisis, and we know that a lot of those hate crimes start as hate speech in digital spaces. And we know that the way that we're talking about hate speech online is through a security threat, right? We know it's a security threat. We saw what happened January 6th. A lot of the insurrectionists were radicalized online, and that is a security threat. But before we get to January 6th, there is a long road of radicalization that happens on these platforms. And I think there's a real need to start thinking about that ladder of engagement towards the extreme as a public health crisis. This is an issue. I was speaking with Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idris at American University a couple weeks ago on a panel, and she was talking about how through studying extreme networks online, we know that a lot of the foundations for radicalization it lives in the mental health space. Mm-hmm. So we also need to start thinking about this as a large-scale mental health crisis.
But I think yesterday was it's an essential connection that's not being made that needs to be. And yesterday was World Mental Health Awareness Day, and thinking about what we frame as a public health crisis and why. And I think that's a really essential component to figuring out how do we do the work that is ahead of us is just what we categorize as a crisis or a security threat. So it's a really, really crucial detail. And the other thing we were going to get into before we talk about how we move forward was just technologies, right? And thinking about this digital engagement in these spaces and and also that the advent of new technologies in the past what shaped how fast or effectively these messages spread. So let's touch on that a little bit, and then we'll get to the more positive, what can we do?
That would be great.
I was thinking about your reminder again that we're here in this apartment where this is 1960s decor, and you were wondering whether the families in this apartment would have come across, some of these messages, and they may have, but there is something about the media revolution. There have been several media revolutions, obviously, right? But there is something about this most recent media revolution, the technological, the social media, where there is so much information, so much media coming at all of us all of the time. We know that we are increasingly in our social media bubbles, so that is something that may continue, or may be a continuing pattern from an earlier time period, because you would have picked up your own community's newspaper and maybe not seen something that was published, half a country away. But there is a really important precedent in that not only has xenophobia continuously been spread through mass media, but it has helped to fuel media revolutions in the past. So I know that the report focuses a lot on fake news, on misinformation, on the distortion of data and facts. And I want to take us back about, several decades to the 1830s, so almost, 200 years ago, when we could name this example as sort of the quintessential fake news of immigration. In 1836, there was a book that was published called The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, and it was an alleged autobiography of a young woman who claimed to have been kidnapped and held hostage in a nunnery, a convent in Montreal, where she reported systematic torture, rape, and infanticide. And it was supposed to be this tell-all, this pulling back the curtains to see what really happens in these Catholic institutions. We know, and it was revealed at the time too, that this was a total fake, that it was an anti-Catholic organization, a group of clergymen who had fabricated this entire tale, published it, and disseminated it alongside their virulently and violent anti-Catholic messages. It was a bestseller in the 1830s, selling something like 300,000 copies, which was a big deal back then. And this is important not only for fueling print culture and book sales at that time, but also it helped to lay the foundations for a new political party called the Native American Party, or the Know Nothings, the anti-Catholic party that came to power. Was very successful, especially in the Northeast. And they came to power on an anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant message, vowing to not restrict immigration, but limit the political power of naturalized citizens and to prevent them from holding office. So media messaging being fueled by xenophobia fueling media revolutions, and laying the groundwork for anti-immigrant political power and laws is a pattern that we've seen for sure before.
Yeah, it sounds like a very effective disinformation
It was.
campaign.
It was.
Well, shall we turn to what we can do?
Yes.
Yes. I'd love to do that.
So what were sort of the takeaways from Define American's report of what we should all know
Yes.
going forward.
It's not all just bleak. I will say one thing we did study really briefly was also how this information is packaged. And we found a pattern that the anti-immigrant sentiment was often packaged in videos that felt educational or almost dry. So if you think about our current media landscape and the level of trust in news media today, it's an all-time low. And folks are going to platforms like YouTube to get educational resources to learn about the world around them, especially when it comes to a topic as confusing and complicated as immigration. So by looking at the way that these messages are packaged, we were able to come up with some tips and recommendations for folks in the immigration space who are looking to create counter narratives, to challenge some of this xenophobic rhetoric, the mis and disinformation that we studied. Some of what we saw was also malinformation. That's statistics taken wildly out of context. So it's not technically untrue, and if you were to fact check it, you would have to take all this time to explain why it's untrue, and guess who's not going to watch that? People on YouTube. So we put together our tips and recommendations into a toolkit that you can see at defineamerican.com. And I think it's also just valuable to look at the tactics of the other side to help identify it when you see it. Because we actually are all being exposed to these talking points in mainstream media constantly. So it's important for us to really dissect and understand what we're viewing.
Absolutely, and just the importance of media literacy and for students to, especially young people, right, to understand what am I looking at, what is it telling me, who made this. That's something we work on all of our tours, right? Anytime we're looking at a primary source, right, who was this for? Why did they make it? Who was the audience? And even if you're looking at a census record, asking those questions helps you then take those questions when you're watching or looking at something after. So that's something that, for us, working with young people every day, working with our visitors, with all of you, right? Just seeing like, hey, let's question what we're looking at and ask ourselves, what its purpose is.
And to be vigilant continuously. I hate to share, but after watching Define American's explainer video, guess what happened? The next one that the next video that automatically played on my feed was one of those educational, nonpartisan, anti-immigrant videos. And so I think we're so used to binge watching, and then just waiting for it to scroll and the next thing to come up, that unless we're vigilant, we may not realize, oh, this is a whole other organization. This is a whole other thing that's coming up.
Yeah, and that takes a real attention and a real organization.
Yeah.
And I also have to say there is tech accountability here too. I mean, the public education around this is extremely important, but until there's more regulation around tech platforms and how they spread mis and disinformation, I think we're really up against it.
Yeah. Well, we didn't mean for this to be one of the reasons why we host our programs on YouTube, but
we
hope that our programs can be a way to share a different type of story, and especially to share stories of our families and stories that show immigration and migration in positive light, in nuanced ways, that it was a sort of meta experience talking about having this conversation on the platform that we are discussing and the platform that the Tenement Museum we use for all of these programs. And I know IHRC also does a lot of work with immigration storytelling.
Yes. So Define Americans, all the videos on how do you define American, but also I've relied upon immigration facts that Define American routinely puts out and educates us all on. Your Story, Our Story program at the Tenement Museum, the Immigrant Stories Digital Storytelling Project at the Immigration History Research Center, we're all in this space to try to impact narrative change, because we know what we're up against, but we also know that changing minds, one story at a time, can help lead to that political change that we also are seeking.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. I want to see if we have any questions from our audience here in the room and anyone online. I think we'll probably have time for a couple questions.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation, the history of xenophobia, and I'm incredibly shocked with the news about that report, but I guess not that shocked at how coordinated the conservatives are, right? So my question, I'm sitting here thinking, I can't help but think that this history of xenophobia is so much like racism. I was wondering if you could, I'm pretty sure you've probably thought about it, but I don't know the connection, but how do you connect it to racism against African Americans and indigenous people that aren't, what we normally think of as immigrants in the U.S.? Thanks.
First of all, you should introduce yourself.
Oh, sure. So I'm Margaret Chin. I'm on the board of the Tenement Museum here. I'm also a professor of sociology at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, and also a board member of the Coalition for a Diverse Harvard.
Thanks, Margaret.
Wonderful.
I can start.
Would you like to
Yeah,
start?
I can start. So this is another important, I think, aspect of the education about xenophobia, past and present. In the past, it has traditionally been, we've actually used anti-immigrant sentiment often in the literature or in our discussions. You've also heard the term nativism, small n, and I have tried to continually push for us to use xenophobia and to define it as part of systemic racism. So if we think back historically, so first of all, xenophobia is fear of the stranger or fear of the other. If we think back historically to the foundations of US history, the first others, the first groups of people who were categorically defined as other and outside of the scope of the nation, meaning inferior, unfit for citizenship, were indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, and then free blacks as well. We always prioritized and privileged the settlement of whites, especially white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So it's not just racism, it's also religion and religious bias and how that intersects with racism. And as new groups of migrants, international migrants, came to the United States, our founding fathers, our institutions started to consider, well, where does this group fit in to this existing hierarchy, this racial hierarchy of white settler and indigenous and enslaved? And we know that some people have moved up and down, across on the spectrum, but it was also always within that framework of the existing white supremacist hierarchy. And that hierarchy then helped to define, of course, where they fit in, but also what rights each group would have, including naturalized citizenship, which in 1790 was already limited to free white persons. And then, of course, other rights as well. But it is built into that foundational system of white supremacy, racism, slavery, and settler colonialism, and continues to be today.
Yeah, I don't know if I could add to everything that Erika just said so eloquently, but I will also just say I think that Native erasure is fundamental to the xenophobic movement, both past and present. And so visibility of Native communities, I think, is an incredibly important cause for anyone interested in immigrant rights, because it's a necessary piece of their narrative to erase those communities. And then also just very broadly, their narratives rely upon essentializing groups. So we saw in the content, it was always the same story. It was always attacking the same communities and using the same stereotypes and labels. So if we can complicate the narrative in the media around the immigrant experience, which obviously is very complicated and multifaceted, it serves towards a better story and really towards our ultimate goal of advocating for immigrant rights. So I think the other side uses racism. I mean, as Erika said, it's so intertwined. It's hard to parse it out, but I do think racism is a really important tool to attack immigrant communities with.
Yeah. Thanks. Really important question.
Great question.
Perfect. And then just to summarize, there's been some really great questions in the chat. I think really specifically looking at or asking questions around young people. So I think we've had teachers asking how they can support students who are in many ways targeted by this media, but also supporting their students in actively responding as well. I think there's questions about the impact on it, younger students, college students who, yes, are digital natives, but how are they affected by this? So I think there's a few people in the chat trying to kind of bring all of their questions together. If you guys would be able to respond to that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can start with this one. I actually have a very tangible recommendation. We found that one of the top content creators pushing anti-immigrant content on YouTube is a site called Prager University. It's not a real university. It's called PragerU, and it's really popular with young people. They're developing curriculums that are being taught in schools, and this is pretty extreme ideology packaged, again, to look innocuous and educational. So my first advice would be educate your students about this group that's pushing out this propaganda, because I guarantee they've been exposed to it. Last time I checked, they had like 4 billion views. 1 in 3 Americans has seen one of their videos. So I think educating your students around that particular site is a tangible recommendation. And then kind of more broadly, I think, again, back to that conversation about extremism and the ladder of engagement towards these extreme online communities, without fail, studies have found that it usually starts from social isolation. So providing mental health resources to your students can be hopefully an effective way to combat the beginning of that horrible journey.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have 2 specific resources for educators as well. So through the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota, we have a free curriculum called Teaching Immigration with Immigrant Stories. It has worksheets, it has both historic and contemporary data, and then our Immigrant Stories digital storytelling project really gives the power of storytelling to individuals, to students, in order to tell us their own journey of immigration, but also their experiences of immigration, of being a newcomer in the United States. And that, we hope, will be part of a larger archive. It already is about 400 stories, but we invite more to help, again, change minds, to preserve the experiences of contemporary immigrants and refugees in order to combat some of the misinformation.
Yeah, and the Tenement Museum as well has resources for teachers. We offer field trips here for students of all ages. We have virtual field trips for wherever your students are in the country. We would love to connect with them, so please reach out if you're interested in booking a program. I think we are a little over time already, but thank you all. It was worth it to hear those 2 really crucial questions. Thank you so much, Erika, Shauna, for digging into this topic with us tonight. And please stay in touch with the Tenement Museum, with Define American, with IHRC. Support these programs. Come back for more. And we hope to see you soon. Take care, everyone.